in Fiction. I'm your host, Arthur Aguirre. I'm a professor in leadership and communication. Living in Fiction is an edutainment podcast where we look at some of the best movies, some of our favorite movies, and some ridiculous movies to see what we've learned to avoid, and what's inspired us. I am continuing onto episode 3 of my rewatch of The Bear. Today we are hitting season 1, episode 7, and the season finale, and then season 2, episode 1. Going to do things a little bit differently. I am going to essentially talk about episodes 7 and 8 of season 1 somewhat together, or what I mean is I'll go over each one individually in terms of what happened, but in terms of everything I want to talk about with regard to communication, it'll kind of be all lumped in right afterwards. And then I'll get into season 2's, the season premiere of season 2. So let's go ahead and get started. So with episode 7, the review, in the aftermath of a great review of the beef, particularly Sydney's cola braised ribs, the crew prepares for their first attempt at taking to-go orders. There is a clear tension between Sydney and Carmen for how the review happened, and when the chaos ensues from the pre-order options accidentally being left on, Carmen explodes on the staff, and Sydney and Marcus leave mid-shift. So a couple things about this episode. I love the way that they open with Chicago by Sufjan Stevens. I wholeheartedly feel often that the music, just like the city, where a movie or a TV show is filmed, plays an integral role in how you feel about it, and very much the music. Love it or hate it, right? I've seen some folks who just hate some of the music that they choose for it, but I think it was a really great way of starting that episode. In terms of the actual review, I do want to talk about that a little bit. So one, I mentioned this on the last episode, Sydney is clearly lying, right? She continues to say that it was an accident, that she had no idea, but at the end of episode 6, we see at the end that she says, we have a VIP on table 21, let's send them a dessert. So she knew exactly who that person was, so she knew who to give her dish to. Carmen is clearly bothered by how this happened. I think he also somewhat knows what happened and that it was intentional and not an accident, but doesn't want to get into it. And this whole incident, especially once she starts getting, the dish itself starts getting praise, but in turn she's getting some praise. Richie starts poking at the bear, poking at the situation. And I wanted to bring this up for a particular reason, because when he addresses Sydney and the whole situation, he is what starts making things personal. Because we've seen this start to boil over, where Richie is skeptical of Sydney and her intentions. We see it a little bit throughout the season. And a lot of it is just his hesitation embracing this new system. But it's at this point we start seeing him making things very personal. He says, are you blowing someone down at the Telegraph? Obviously, that's incredibly inappropriate regardless, but incredibly inappropriate in a workplace. And when he makes things personal in that way, you can see that changes how Sydney starts talking to him. Because she had started seeing a different side of Richie. I think it started when I believe it was episode 2 when they went to go to the hardware store together, and she saw the way he was with his daughter. But this turns things around a little bit, and you can see how things starting to devolve in that episode. So that means that later on, when things started getting really chaotic, she starts getting incredibly personal with Richie and says some really harsh things. Eventually, if you've seen this episode, Carmen just loses it on everyone. Yells at Sydney. And the thing I want to bring up is we knew that she was sensitive about this exact thing happening, because if you remember from episode 5 of this season, Sydney talks to Carmen about her previous experience. She shares her story, how she messed up in her catering business, and she specifically says, it was the first time I didn't have a complete and utter psychopath behind me screaming and pushing and yelling, and I thought I wanted that, but look where that got me. So he knows that this is something that she's experienced before, and if you talk to anyone in the restaurant industry, it can be pretty common. But clearly she's doing this thing and hoping that this is a different type of experience, and it just evolves into, essentially she makes her first major mistake, and it leads to him just completely blowing up on her. Some odds and ends with this episode. When Richie is getting stitched up after Sydney accidentally stabs him, during Ibra stitching him up, he asks Ibra to tell him more about the Civil War, and he starts telling him all these stories. And you can tell they do this often. I think it's a really warm moment where Ibra is taking care of Richie, but you can clearly tell they have a really special, this is a little thing that they do often. I just love seeing that. Getting into episode 8, the Brajal episode, Carmi speaks for the first time at Al-Anon. It's a really incredible monologue from Jeremy Allen White. The restaurant hosts a bachelor party, and Carmen tries to fix relationships that he's damaged. We start the episode off with this dream sequence where Carmen is talking to a fictional audience as the host of a cooking show, explaining. We finally hear exactly how Michael died. We hear how Carmen feels his feelings about not being able to work there and the fact that he's not good enough to have worked there. And we go back during this dream sequence to him, that image of him from episode 1 of him with the bear on the bridge. And now we know that this is where his brother took his own life. And it's why we see Carmen facing essentially the specter of the bear getting released on that bridge with him inheriting this restaurant. In the Al-Anon monologue, he talks about how his brother could make him feel confident in himself just facing whatever, situation he's going up against. And we get the saying that eventually becomes kind of the mantra for the show of let it rip. In terms of how things start shaping up and how they start coming back together, we see Tina show up to the shop dressed as Sid, is what Carmen says. Eventually Marcus does show up back at the restaurant, and Carmen goes up to him and really does give a very sincere apology. She says, I'm so sorry, Chef. I'm so sorry, Chef. I'm glad you're back. Marcus just says heard, Chef, and it seems like they're pretty much squared away. Tina explicitly tells him, if you ever try that shit with me, I'll fuck your ass up. Before I get into the text message exchange with Sydney, essentially his apology, which is really different from the one he gave Marcus, I want to talk about this incident that happens kind of in the middle of everything, where Carmen is trying to light a cigarette and he accidentally, there's a fire goes up in the kitchen. And it goes back to that convo that he had with Marcus from, I think it was episode 3 or 4, where he says, you have that moment where you think I can let this place burn down and all my anxiety and stress go with it. And Marcus says, and then you put out the fire. Carmi says, and then you put out the fire. But in this moment, he does not put out the fire. He is just staring at it. Now, we've seen this happen before in his kitchen when he's daydreaming, but this is not him daydreaming, right? He is staring, everything from episode 7 had happened. Things feel really messy right now, and he is just staring at this fire and not doing anything. He does not put out that fire, but his team does. We see Tina and Sweeps go in. Richie slaps him and kind of makes sure that he's okay. But it's a great representation that often if you're by yourself, you have to make that decision, right? You're on your own and you're the one that has to put out that fire, but it's his team. His team that is what comes together and puts this fire out. And I think it's representative of what we're hoping to see in season 2. Moving on to the apology to Sydney, it's really just texting, right? He starts it off by talking about her dish and what it needs. She is not really having it. And he just says, my behavior was not okay. She says, correct. He says, yes, Chef. Last check is ready whenever. Episode ends. Not ends, but it kind of all gets squashed because Sydney walks in, sees that they had found all this money, essentially Cicero's money that Michael had been putting away. Tina calls her Chef. Richie essentially starts treating her like family, right? He says, Sid, quit fucking around, grab a can opener. He treats her like family, where you say and do wild shit and just get back to being part of the group again. And Carmen immediately, once he starts talking to her, starts brainstorming ideas for the new restaurant with her. She says okay, and then you see them eating family meal together. So what I want to talk about in terms of episode 7 and episode 8. First, I want to talk about this model right here. It's called the synergistic model of communication. A lot of things you can look at here, but essentially when we're talking to someone on an interpersonal level, these are all the things that are going on, right? We have, your relationship to that person. Both of you are acting as sender and receiver. You have the message going on. You have the channel that you're using, whether it is face-to-face text messaging, FaceTime, Zoom, whatever it might be. We have all these different individual societal forces. We have the culture of your own culture as well as the culture of the organization or the place that you're in. We have noise. It could be actual physical noise, like the sounds of the restaurant. It could be psychological noise. It could be physiological noise, like if you're dealing with pain or anything like that. But I really want to focus on this title right above the picture, the field of experience. Your field of experience is anything you've ever experienced up to that point. So everything about your childhood, the friends that you had, the schools that you went to, the movies and TV shows that you watched, music that you listened to, video games, what faith you have, what religion you grew up with, all of those things make up your field of experience. It is why when I ask someone whether you prefer Pepsi or Coke, you immediately have a decision on which one is your preference, right? And then you have the weird people who really like Pepsi, or you have the people who are like, why are you drinking soda at all? You should be drinking water. But you have usually folks have a very firm stance on which one is better, or some, stance on the issue. But it also then makes sense then if you have such a strong feeling about which soda you like, you also, when you start getting into tense things like abortion or the death penalty or politics or anything in general like that, why it becomes so heated? Because it's not just like this kind of blasé feeling you have about something. It is ingrained in you from your field of experience. All that being said, your field of experience is also what informs the way you have interpersonal relationships, interpersonal communication, and conflict. All of those things are part of your field of experience. It's informed by your field of experience. So Carmen and Sydney, even though they have a similar experience in the culinary arts, at least somewhat in terms of their formal education with it, they have completely different backgrounds in terms of their family and what they expect when it comes to conflict. Richie, same thing. So Richie and Carmen have more in common because of that shared history. But the way you handle conflict, or the way that you've seen people handle conflict, really is informed by that field of experience. And if you've seen season 2 already, you get a better idea of how Carmen's association, or where his association with conflict comes from. The way he is shouting is something that is just normal, both in terms of what he experienced in working at a restaurant, because we've seen those flashbacks with his former chef played by Joel McHale. But in season 2, we get an idea of what his mom was like, what some of his family, his brother was like, where shouting was part of the norm. And so that was very normal for him, and that is not exactly what Sydney was expecting. And so I thought it was important because whether it was the interaction Sydney was having with Richie or the interaction Carmen was having with Sydney and or Marcus, all of these things, you have to understand when you're talking to someone, your field of experience and their field of experience is basically bumping up against each other, right? It's why it's so easy to have a conflict when you're discussing or having a conversation with someone who has such a radically different viewpoint of yours, because of that field of experience that is informing that conversation. All that being said, that also, I think it's important that we talk about conflict and power. A couple things when it comes to conflict. So one, it has to begin with the perception, right? You have to understand that you are in an argument. And in this situation, I think it was pretty clear that they understood that. But it involves clashes in goals or behaviors. It's a process, so it's something that's ongoing. It's not just a situational thing. And it's dynamic, right? It is constantly changing in terms of how your feelings are, what emotions are going on at a time, what actions are taking place. Now, conflict often arises because there's some sort of power imbalance. And there are different ways that people either are given or thought of as having power. There's different kind of power that you can have, and you can have multiple kinds of power at a time. So just a few of them to go over. So there's resource power, right? Having material things such as money, property, and food. We see that very clearly with Cicero or Jimmy, where they, particularly in season 2, episode 1, where they're going to him for more money, right? We clearly see that he has that type of power. There's expertise power, where you have like a special skill or knowledge. Sydney, especially Carmen, they have that expertise power. You can have power through your social network. So a person who is linked with a network of friends, family, and acquaintances with substantial influence. Again, Cicero or Jimmy have that kind of power. Carmen has it somewhat, particularly because of the circles that he ran in with in terms of his culinary experience. We have personal power, so personal characteristics that people consider desirable. So it could be beauty, intelligence, charisma, communication skills, sense of humor. Any of those things can give you some sense of power. And then we have intimacy power, which is it's not just a sexual thing, although that can definitely be part of it. If you ever had a friend who has a new love interest, that love interest typically has a little bit more power in that initial part of their relationship because they have that intimate bond. But it's just if you share a close bond with someone that no one else shares. So I think that's why we see Richie thinking that he has much more power in the restaurant because of his relationship with Carmen. But you can clearly see how all of those things can eventually cause some sort of conflict because of the power imbalance. Richie, because of one, his history with the restaurant, his history with Michael, and his history with Carmen, all of those things are influencing his interactions with Sydney, who is new to the restaurant. And Sydney has this expertise power that Richie doesn't have. And so you can see how, in addition to the personal things that are going on, we also have these power imbalances that are happening as well. We also see it with Sydney and Carmen because even though they have very shared expertise knowledge, he's the owner of the restaurant, right? So he has that power imbalance, or essentially that power over Sydney, so he can make those decisions about telling her, to do exactly what he wants her to do. All that being said, right, you have to understand that those power imbalances can cause conflict, but conflict can arise from a number of different things. A couple things to take away here. First of all, as a leader, you have to be aware of conflict and the conflict going on with your team members. Chaos is going to happen, and it clearly happens in this situation. And at one point, I don't know if it was intentional or accident, but he put Sydney and Richie on the same task of making more jardinier. I'm butchering that pronunciation. But that is not something you want to do, especially if you know that these are two people that are in a really heated conflict. You want to give them time away from one another, and we see that's where that attacking of that individual person happens. And one thing I want to mention here, particularly in that situation, right? I mentioned that Richie's the one that first made it personal, and so of course Sydney makes it personal. There are studies that show that getting that kind of revenge on someone and saying something really hurtful can hit like a pleasure sense in your brain. I get it. I love making people laugh. The inverse of that is I can be very sarcastic. And when I am in the middle of a conflict, my default impulse is to want to be sarcastic and make a joke out of things, right? Because I can feel how good, it is a fantastic feeling for 3 seconds. I remember specifically having a conflict with someone who I'm trying to resolve this conflict, and I'm doing everything. I think I understand that in that moment there are a few things people want when they feel they have a grievance against you, right? They want to feel heard. They want to hear an apology. And so I usually try to do that, right? Try to let them know I understand where they're coming from, and I apologize that this is happening. Here's how we move forward. I had a person that regardless kept going back and just was upset. And I remember just saying, well, look, I don't have my time machine with me, so there's nothing I can do to go back and fix it. So how can we just move forward with this? They very much did not appreciate that. Felt very good to say. But all that being said, it will feel good in that moment to get your kind of retribution and say things that will make you feel better. But that is a very short-term solution that is going to affect a long-term relationship, right? You have to think about what relationship you have with that person and what relationship you want to continue to have with that person, right? What I say in this moment, is this going to make things better or 10 times worse? So those are two things about that situation. One, Carmen should have been more aware of that and not put them on the same station. And two, there is no reason to make things personal, especially in that moment. But in general, there's different ways of approaching conflict and trying to resolve conflict. This is the Thomas Kilmann conflict model. I'm sure some of you all have seen this if you studied conflict or mediation or anything along those lines. We have assertiveness on the left hand. We have cooperativeness on the bottom there. And they all you can see where all of these different approaches fit on this graph here. We have completely avoiding, which a lot of people end up doing when it comes to conflict, right? You take a step back from conflict and let it play out. You often pretend it isn't happening, and if you do communicate, it's completely indirectly. We have competing, right? Focus on getting your own perspective accepted. We have accommodating, where you just let the person have or do whatever it is that they want. We have compromising with, which often a lot of people think is the best possible solution, but it really isn't. If you look at this little green and red I have on here, you reach a consensus that's acceptable to people, but there's a little bit of losing that goes on for each individual as well. Ideally, what you should be doing or try to do is collaborating, right? You come together to develop a mutually beneficial solution. And if you want to take a collaborative approach, there are some things that you can do. One, you want to attack the problem and not people. You want to focus on common interest and long-term goals. You want to create options before arriving at a decision. And you want to critically evaluate your solution. Now, in terms of some short-term solutions, before you get into the long-term solutions, there's a couple things that you can do. One, you could separate, right? Sometimes you just need a break. Like clearly in that situation, Richie and Sydney needed a break from one another. You know, even Carmen and Sydney needed a break. Like, ideally, you probably could have just said, hey, well, this is not going to happen. We'll fulfill as many orders as we can, but people are just going to have to understand what these issues are. I'm sure we've all been to a restaurant where, like, they have a sign up or the server has to tell you that they're out of something. Like, there are different ways of handling this. And, but in terms of your staff, like separating people, it could be a good idea. Domination. This happens all the time where folks, these aren't necessarily solutions that you should take, but these are short-term solutions that people often will take. Domination, right, where you're just saying, I am going to win no matter what it takes. And we can see that Sydney and Richie are in the middle of trying to do that domination approach. We can compromise, like we talked about, where both parties change their goals to make them compatible, but it can often lead to resentment and regret. We have an integrated agreement. So the two sides preserve and attain their goals by developing a creative solution to their problem, and it's a win-win solution where you remain committed to your individual goals, but flexible on how to achieve them, right? I think that's the whole point about collaboration or integrated agreement is it's not like a compromise where you have to sacrifice what some of your goals are. You figure out what your goals are, and then you decide, like, what are some innovative ways that we haven't thought about where we can achieve all of these things together, where we maybe have to work a little bit harder, but we don't have to sacrifice what we want. And lastly, we have structural improvement. So people agreeing to change the basic rule or understandings that govern their relationship to prevent further conflict. So maybe Richie and Sydney agree that when things get tense, they stay off, they stay away from each other, or something along those lines where you figure out a way of handling these this type of conflict in the future. All that being said, like I mentioned, we have to consider the person we're talking with or arguing with, what their field of experience is, or how that's informing the conversation. We have to think about what do we want our relationship to be moving forward, because that sarcasm, like I said, it feels great for a short period of time, but it can do some really long-lasting damage to your relationship. And usually, at least for me, you feel terrible right after maybe not right after, but eventually you do feel terrible about what you are saying to that person. And lastly, what I want to say in terms of how Carmen resolves everything. I think I mentioned it. He does things very differently with Sydney than he does with Marcus. But say sorry, right? If you blow up on someone and it was completely inexcusable, you have to apologize. Sometimes that's all people are looking for is an I'm sorry. I use this example all the time because I'm sure you've heard this before, the difference between impact and intent. Even if you don't intend on hurting someone, sometimes you do. And if you accidentally hurt someone, like, you need to say sorry, right? And the example I used to tell people is if I am cooking in the kitchen and I'm holding a knife and you call my name and I turn and I accidentally cut you, I'm not going to blame you and say, why were you standing next to me? I'm going to say, oh my God, I am so sorry. I did not mean to do that. I didn't know you were that close to me. We see this play out exactly between Sydney and Richie. She says nothing. She just stands back because she is in the middle of this heated situation. But that was an accident. But clearly that is still something you apologize for. That oftentimes, even if you didn't intend to hurt someone, but if you left that kind of an impact, sometimes all they want to hear is I'm sorry. So that is those are some of the lessons I learned from episode 7 and the season finale for season 1. Let's get into season 2, episode 1. So, titled The Beef, Carmen, Sydney, Nat, and the rest of the crew start making plans for the new restaurant. Carmen and Nat realize they need more money and ask Cicero to give them more money and become a partner. And once he's on board, they make adjustments to their timeline to make sure they can hit their 18-month deadline. I want to start off by 2 scenes that really just make me laugh. One, When Sydney leans on the wall and puts her arm through it, right? People start coming in and checking in on her. Marcus says, "What happened?" She says, "I fell through the wall. I fell through the wall." And he says, "Damn, you got strong." It cracks me up every single time. Later on, when Nat and Carmen are talking in the little office, the alarm starts going off because Richie went up to get the paint from the crawl space. And as the alarm goes off, Carmen looks at Nat and goes, "Is that in my head?" Just, it's great. It's a great show. People ask, like, when it started winning a bunch of Emmys for a comedy show, people were like, "How is this a funny show?" It's hilarious. All right. Anyway, so let's get into it. I think the big thing I want to talk about here is purpose. Richie starts talking about purpose, and Carmen first says, "I love you, but I don't have time for this." And he pauses and says, "I do have time for this." He tells this great story, or Richie tells this great story about he's reading a book, and he's worried that because he doesn't have his purpose at eventually this new team, and he's trying to find his place in this team, that they're just going to drop his ass. And I think it's really important to think about that idea that if you don't feel like you belong somewhere, it's hard to really feel that your purpose is there. I also think it's important here that Carmen was about to leave and just say, "I don't have time for this," but he realized that Richie's going through it, right? He's not upstairs, going over the logistics of how this new restaurant's going to happen. He is downstairs, like, really contemplating his life. And Carmen reads that and sees that for what it is, and he's like, "Oh, I need to hear this guy out. I need to give him, like, this soundboard that I should be as a leader." So I thought that was great. You have to listen to your team. We also see, I think I talked about this a couple episodes ago, Sydney is knocking out some of these administrative skills in terms of being a leader, right? She is talking about thinking about this in terms of it being a long-term project, right? It usually takes a lot of foresight and management. You need to trust people will do their job. You have to foresee issues and problems, and she is on board. Like, she is trying to get Nat on board. Like, you can see her learning from her past mistakes and really trying to do this the right way. We see a huge change in the relationship between Tina and Sydney. We see Tina showing up to check on Sydney after she heard she fell through the wall. And man, that scene where Sydney asks Tina if she wants to be her sous chef or her chef, buddy, that gets me every time. I particularly, I have someone in my family who's a little bit older who had to try to switch careers, and I saw how hard it was for this person, and it just killed me to see them, like, struggling like that. And so to see Tina go from struggling to get on board with this new system to just embracing this role and getting emotional for being asked to be the sous chef, I love it. We already see a new, different approach to the leadership, where we see this three-headed approach to leadership with Carmen, Sydney, and Nat. But when they're asking Cicero for money, we still see Carmen taking ownership and doing things his own way, where he is the one that tells Cicero, like, "We will pay you back in 18 months." Like, that was his decision. That's a tough decision to pay that much money back in such a short amount of time. One of the last things I want to talk about before I summarize it is I love this back and forth that they show between Marcus and his mom, and they're going to do that throughout the season. But it's a really stark reminder that people have lives outside of their jobs, right? So we have Marcus who's trying to learn this new system. We have Marcus who's trying to create this brand new donut that we saw in episode 7. And at the same time, he is dealing with an ailing family member. And I think it's important when we're dealing with our team members that we understand that they have lives outside of the workplace that are way more important than what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. All that being said, like I said, the big thing for me is purpose. Richie is trying to find a place in the organization, people who feel belonging. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like, belonging is such a critical part of being a human being. And if it is a place where you're working and you don't feel like you belong, I mean, it could just kill you. And as a leader, those are the people that can often slow you down. And I don't say that in a negative way, but it's folks who are scared of change. They feel like there's not going to be a place for them in the future. You have to make their place, you have to make them feel wanted. You have to give them that purpose that we've talked about so many times already. And Richie flat out says he's looking for that purpose, and Carmen has to take that on and lead him with that purpose. And we even see that right away, where Richie sees that the poster got torn up when Sydney falls through it. Carmen asks him to get the paint from the crawl space. Richie says, "I'm on the operating table right now." And he says, "Purpose, chef." And he's like, "Got it." And so there, and if you've seen all of season 2 already, you know that there is a heck of a payoff later on in the season in terms of Richie finding his purpose. So hope you enjoyed this episode going over the end of season 1 and the beginning of season 2. Next week I'll be going over episodes 2, 3, and 4. Thank you so much for viewing. Please do me a favor, if you can share this or go to my Instagram, which is Inviting Difference, share some of share some of my reels, or encourage people to subscribe, whether it's the podcast or YouTube, whatever it might be. But I appreciate you watching if you're watching. And like I said, come back for next week while I'll be going over the next 3 episodes of season 2.